Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning into this interview, which is a part of our Radical Body Conference, Living Tantra for Modern Life. I'm really excited to introduce Swami Khecaranatha, who's going to be talking to me today about his newest book, Divine Thread, the Stillness Sutras, and we're going to talk a little bit about the philosophy that he explores in that text, especially as it relates to the rise of Kundalini and the process that we know as Kundalini Awakening. So hello, Nataji. Thanks so much
Hello.
for agreeing to interview with me today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure. I've really enjoyed exploring your book. I've really enjoyed this is such a passion, this Shaivite Kashmiri tradition. So it's always such a pleasure to read about the philosophy from a fresh perspective, or from a different voice, or from a unique voice. So to start off, I would love to just hear, since we are, here in this conference on the teachings of Shaivism and Tantra, I would love to hear a little bit about how you first discovered these teachings and how they've influenced your life in a more personal way.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I began my spiritual practice when I was about 20 years old. I met my teacher, Swami Khecaranathawill, who was an American master who lived in New York City, and he was one of the very early people who brought Kundalini Yoga practices to the United States. So I was very grateful to have met him, and I met him in 1972. He passed in 73, so I wasn't with him for very long.
Wow.
Rudy was a person who had begun his spiritual practice very early and had begun to go to India in the mid-50s. 1952, I think, was the first time he went there. And he went there because he had a deep spiritual need and quest, and understood that there were resources available to him there.
Mm-hmm.
He actually met his teacher, which is a man named Swami Bhagavan Nityananda, who was a very, very famous person in India. Rudy met him in 1959, and his teacher, Nityananda, passed in 61, and then he studied with Swami Muktananda, who was a person who was part of the Nityananda lineage. But the whole time that Rudy practiced there, he didn't do any study at all in terms of any philosophical, study, didn't read books, etc. He just did his inner work. And as he got into the late 60s, the early 70s, and really began teaching a lot and attracting a lot of people, of course, myself included, we were coming out of the hippie days, of course, etc. And he very quickly made it clear to us that what he was interested in terms of the Indian tradition was the content and not the container. And so he was, in fact, really not that interested in studying the philosophy. We didn't chant, etc. His experience was all of us young people who went from wearing hippie clothes went to wearing yogi clothes, and etc. And he realized the superficiality of that, right? And he was an extraordinary person with true spiritual depth. So we didn't really study any text, any of the context and tradition with him. He passed in 73, and we continued to do our work, etc. A number of us were initiated as teachers by him. And then around 1972, 1973, then the Tantric Shaivite tradition began to emerge in terms of material, which is probably one of the reasons Rudy didn't study it, because it just wasn't available. I mean, nobody had heard of Shaivism at all, etc., until then. So as some of that began to emerge, then we began to just look at it and study it a little bit. And of course, in the early days, there was very little that came out, right? But what was really wonderful for us, Jacob, was that as we began to study it, we really understood and recognized the practice that we had received from Rudy as the practice that emerges out of philosophy. In fact, the reality is philosophy, particularly from the Tantric tradition, emerged out of experience. And so we began to study it, and it really helped us to, if you will, to articulate our own experience and to place our own experience within the Shaivite tradition. And so we began to study it more and more, and as more and more information came out, then we grasped a hold of that. I've spent time with some of the different people, Sanderson, Mark Dyskovsky, etc. And what I've tried to do is always try to extract really the essence of the philosophy, and particularly to make sure that in myself, but particularly for my students, that they understand the application of that philosophy in terms of their own life. Right. And so that's what I've done over the last 10 years, particularly, is, and all of my books except my first book really are an attempt to extract different parts of the non-dual tantric tradition and discuss them in different ways. And Divine Thread is certainly that. So I don't know if I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, that's very helpful. That's a great segue, because one thing that I really did appreciate about your book is while there's a lot of literature that unpacks the philosophy in a pretty abstract way, and it can get very dense. What's really beautiful about your book is that you take the very esoteric philosophy and you make it very accessible, by referencing ways in which we can apply these principles to our lives, and it really grounds the philosophy in a way that I think is really helpful for a lot of people. So I hope a lot of people get their hands on your book, especially through this talk. So,
well,
yeah. So then let's just get into that. So you wrote this book called The Divine Thread, and we're going to explore a lot of themes from it today. So to start off with, what is the Divine Thread?
Well, the Divine Thread is an experience that we have generally through lots of years of practice. And it really is a discovery. It's a recognition that we are manifest expressions of consciousness. And within the Kundalini Tantric tradition, it's very clear we begin to have the experience that we exist because of what's called Kundalini Shakti, right? That out of this infinite pure consciousness, with the will and the intent to manifest, which has manifested not just the whole world and the whole universe, but manifested us as individuals, as individual expressions of itself. And that, in fact, is the most succinct definition of Kundalini. We are individuated expressions of that divine consciousness, right? And so, of course, everything that manifests is manifest from that consciousness as energy, an energy that ultimately condenses into form. And so it's important, I think, for people to understand that Kundalini is our essence. We are alive, function, live, breathe because of that Kundalini force, which, if you will, one way of thinking of it is that it's just this thread that falls out of consciousness, and out of which we form. And what's really wonderful to think about in terms of that is that I think it was in my first book, but there's what science has discovered is that when a person is when a man and woman have a baby, right, and the person becomes pregnant, the woman becomes pregnant, the first thing that appears is within the woman is what is a streak of light, right? before the embryo, before any kind of physicality, etc. It's a streak of light. And what's really wonderful, if you look at it from that perspective, is everything forms from that streak of light. Well, that streak of light is that light of God, if you will, but it is that Kundalini from which everything forms around it, the psychic body, the physical body, et cetera, et cetera. And so that divine thread really is I describe it as God dropping us out of an eyedropper. We are dropped out of that infinite awareness, and we are created. And so Kundalini Shakti is that individuated expression of the divine, and our practice in the Sushumna and the ascent of our awareness through the Sushumna is the ascent back into that supreme consciousness, back to God, if you will. I use God, Shiva, consciousness, interchangeable. I fortunately didn't grow up where God was something different, etc. So, yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So one thing that really stands out to me about that is that essentially what you're saying is that we're made of Kundalini, correct?
Yes.
We're made of Kundalini.
Yes.
And I feel like that's sort of different from the way that a lot of people think about it. It's sort of like I might be made of something else, and then I have something else called Kundalini, which is sort of dormant inside me. So I'd love for you to maybe, do you see there being a kind of misunderstanding of the nature of Kundalini in general?
Yes, because typically people have the understanding or even the experience of Kundalini as something, as you said, something else that's happening in them, right? It's going off, it's arising, it's awakening, it's making me crazy, it's making me feel good, right? And it's not something that's separate from us. It is, in fact, our core, right? That Shakti, which when you talk about Shakti from an individual point of view, that is called Kundalini. Shakti that creates the manifest world is something different, but the individuated person is, in essence, Kundalini. And that people don't understand that, and so then they think something's happening to them that's part of something other part of themselves, right? And it's not that. And the beauty of when Kundalini begins to awaken, which we can of course explore a lot more, is that we can begin to understand that difference. We misunderstand what it is when it first starts happening, etc. But if we stay with it, and particularly if we can, through some disciplined practice, and generally with the help of some teacher who has some experience in that, can then channel our own awareness, connect our own awareness with internally, so that the Kundalini ascends through the Sushumna. So in order to really allow that process to take place, right, which is not instigated by us. Most people think they did something to make it happen, and we'll discuss that, right? But to allow that to happen, our energy, our awareness, our focus, our life force has to be rechanneled into the Sushumna. And when it's not, is when people have lots of difficulty, a lot of emotional reaction, a lot of psychological challenges, et cetera, et cetera. And that's just part of what's happening there, is that the Kundalini has somehow released itself, right? And it's beginning to move through all the systems of the human being, right? And if it's not channeled correctly, then it can create challenges, right?
Yeah. So okay, so that you mentioned about how, the beginning of this process of awakening is not something that you can make happen. So I'd love to move into kind of a discussion of what I think is correctly called Shaktipat, correct?
Yes.
Would that sort of indicate the beginning of the process?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So then, so let's talk about that. So say, so, someone's listening to this talk, they're watching us, have this discussion, and they're like, okay, that all sounds great. I really want to start that process. But from what I understand, it's not something that you can kind of force in that way. So would you talk a little bit about why that is, like what the status of the beginning of this process, what the status is of the beginning of this process, and what makes it so that it can't be something that is made to happen?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. It's a very important question, and probably the fundamental misunderstanding and yet revelation that happens when Kundalini begins to awaken, right? And Kundalini awakens for one reason. It begins to wake up, if you will, for one reason, and that's because God wills it, right? It happens through grace. Shaktipat means the descent of grace. And so somebody meditating, somebody listening, some weird guy named Nataji talking, somebody seeing a book on a shelf, all these things are things we think we did something, and so therefore, oh, I did that and it awakened my Kundalini, right? And some people will say, okay, I had a big traumatic experience and it awakened my Kundalini. All of those things are simply the shell and the particular experience that we have, but Kundalini is awakened because Shiva, God, who incarnated us, dropped us out of himself, and chooses to call us back home, if you will, right? And that's why Kundalini awakens, right? And it's very difficult for people, most people, including myself, to understand that that's what's happening in the beginning, right? But that's really what happens, because that Kundalini force is dormant in the individual, dormant in the sense that we're not aware of it, right? It's always active. We wouldn't be alive, we wouldn't breathe, we wouldn't have a body if it wasn't for Kundalini. It is really the awakening to that Kundalini force as our spiritual essence, as our self, that is really what's happening when somehow, by the grace of God, we begin to wake up, right? And so Shaktipat is the descent of God's grace. Unfortunately, over the last 20 years or so, there's been a lot of confusion perpetrated by different teachers, etc. That the teacher gives Shaktipat.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's a little slightly off.
Right.
The guru is an agent of Shakti, right? But Shaktipat, which is grace, which only God can confer grace, right? Happens because of Shiva, because of God. Then what you come to understand, and the Tantric tradition is very clear about this, if you really look at its depth, that when grace happens, there's kind of a twofold thing that starts to unfold. Some part of us, some wish arises in us, some intention says, I want to know more, I want to know my true self. There's more to life than Monday Night Football, or whatever it is, right? And sometimes, that's not something that we didn't make that happen, right? My own story of how I met my teacher, is a perfect example of that, but we don't need to get into that necessarily. But what happens when that grace sends us the email, God says, wake up, right? Come on home. A twofold thing happens. That wish arises, and in that wish, there is a simultaneous intention, desire, understanding to find a teacher, right? Because that teacher is the empowering energy that nourishes and feeds and gives us the energy to allow that grace to continue to awaken us, right? And so that's not really discussed that much particularly in westernized tantric practices and the discussion of teachers, and it's important to really understand that all of it is really grace that's awakening you. But grace, so you can think of it, well, God gives me a car. Isn't that nice? I got a car. Doesn't have any fuel in it, right? So it can't go anywhere, right? So the teacher is an agent of that energy. That provides us with energy, most importantly, and with direction to how to at once have the inner discipline, develop the meditation practices to channel that energy within ourselves, and how to engage the world that we are part of from that place of energy and that place of flow, right?